"You'll never find someone better than me," he said. But months later she appeared with someone unthinkable. Helen opened her eyes to the muted light of early morning, filtering through the lace curtains, the same light that had greeted her for over 4 decades, spilling gently into the bedroom she once shared with Richard. But now even the sun seemed more cautious, more tender in its arrival. She lay still for a moment, her ears catching the familiar melody of birdsong outside the window, sparrows and finches weaving their music through the quiet. Yet the absence was louder. The space beside her in bed remained untouched, its sheets smooth and undisturbed. Silence filled the room, not as peace but as echo. She turned her head, half expecting to see his reading glasses perched crookedly on the nightstand, or the morning newspaper folded and waiting. But there was only stillness. A stillness that no longer soothed but reminded. Slowly, deliberately, she sat up and planted her feet on the floor. Her slippers were exactly where she'd left them the night before, but even that simple consistency seemed to mock her. The motions of routine felt hollow now. She passed the hallway where framed photographs lined the wall, snapshots of a life shared. Helen and Richard on their wedding day, his hand resting on her waist, her eyes alight with laughter. Christmas mornings surrounded by children in pajamas, a trip to the coast, their silhouettes outlined by a setting sun. She walked past each one with practiced blindness, not daring to pause. Not yet. The kitchen greeted her with the scent of old wood and faded spices. She reached for the kettle, her hands instinctively moving through the motions. Fill, click, wait. While the water heated, she retrieved 2 mugs from the cupboard. Only when she placed them on the table did she realize what she'd done. One mug was his, chipped on the rim, blue with a faded map of the Great Lakes. She stared at it, unmoving, until the kettle clicked off with a sharp final note. She sat down slowly, her knees aching more than usual, and wrapped her hands around her own mug. Across the table, Richard's chair sat pushed back slightly, as if he'd just stepped away for a moment. As if he'd return any second with a book in hand or some trivial observation about the weather. The chair's emptiness throbbed in her vision. It was not just an absence, it was a presence that made her chest tighten. Outside, the birds continued their chatter. Life went on. But inside that kitchen, inside her, everything had slowed. Months had passed since Richard's passing, and yet each morning felt like waking up to the news all over again. Friends had stopped calling every day. Meals had become smaller, quieter. The world had resumed its rhythm, leaving Helen behind in the lingering stillness. She reached for a piece of toast, but found she wasn't hungry. Hunger had become something distant, like laughter or warmth, things she remembered but no longer felt in the same way. Her appetite had been replaced by memory. She would see a jar of marmalade and remember how Richard hated it, hear a piece of classical music on the radio, and feel his fingers tapping on the table in time. Even the breeze through the kitchen window sometimes carried a scent that reminded her of him. Soap, aftershave, old paper. Helen had always imagined grief would feel like a storm, something furious and loud, but instead it was a quiet erasure, a soft, steady removal of color and sound. It was waking up and realizing the world hadn't changed, but she had. Everything now existed in 2 versions, before and after. She took a sip of tea, its warmth grounding her momentarily. Then she looked at the empty chair again. It was amazing, she thought, how one piece of furniture could hold so much weight. His absence wasn't confined to that chair. It echoed in the creak of the floorboards, in the way the light no longer danced in his eyes, in the silence that wrapped around her like a too heavy coat. Helen breathed in slowly and stood. There was laundry to fold, a floor to sweep. Small things that once felt routine now offered her a strange form of comfort. Movement, at least, kept the silence from devouring everything. But as she passed the hallway again, her eyes caught a photograph, one she hadn't really looked at in weeks. Richard holding their youngest grandson, both of them mid-laugh. The sight stopped her. Her hand reached out, almost without thinking, touching the glass. "I hope you're still laughing," she whispered. And then the silence answered back, not with words, but with its relentless, suffocating stillness. She moved on. There would be other mornings, other sips of tea, other empty chairs. But today the ache was fresh, the silence loud, and Helen, alone in the house that still bore the shape of love, had no choice but to carry both. Helen sat by the window later that evening, her cup of tea turning cold in her hands, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the kitchen like an unwanted guest. She had left the curtains half open, enough to see the dimming sky outside streaked with orange and purple, but not enough to feel truly connected to the world beyond her walls. The truth was, she had grown afraid of evenings. Afternoons slipped away quietly, but twilight carried weight. It was the hour when Richard used to come into the room, his voice filling the air, his familiar steps crossing the wooden floor. Now, the fading light only sharpened his absence. She closed her eyes and tried to silence her thoughts, but one sentence kept rising, insistent as a tolling bell. She could hear it as clearly as if Richard had just spoken it. "You will never find someone better than me." He had said it dozens of times through the years, always with that crooked grin, always in a tone that was playful but edged with certainty. She would laugh, roll her eyes, maybe swat his arm, but she never challenged it. In those moments, it was easier to smile and let him have the last word. After all, wasn't there a truth in it? They had built a life so full, so intertwined, that she could never imagine anyone else fitting into it. But now, alone with the silence, the words did not feel like a joke. They felt like a warning, a verdict she had not agreed to but was forced to serve. They echoed when she rose from bed in the morning, when she stirred her tea, when she passed the empty chair at the table. It was as if Richard's voice had become another presence in the house, lingering even though he was gone. And each time the phrase returned, she felt something inside her tighten, an invisible rope binding her to the past, refusing to let her move. She wondered if he had truly meant it deep down. Did he say it because he believed their bond was unmatched, that no one else could ever compare? Or had it been a way to anchor her to him, to ensure that even in his absence, she would belong only to his memory? These were questions she had never dared to ask while he was alive. Their marriage had been full of laughter, tenderness and shared burdens, but also unspoken truths. Now she was left to untangle them alone, sifting through the echoes like someone searching for light in the dark. Helen rose from the chair and paced the kitchen. The words clung to her thoughts no matter what she did. She wiped the counter even though it was clean. She rearranged the mugs in the cupboard, only to put them back exactly as they had been. Her hands itched for action, but no task seemed enough to quiet her mind. Eventually, she returned to the table, pressing her palms against the cool wood. She remembered how Richard had said it the very last time. It had been only months before his illness worsened, when they were sitting outside on the porch one warm evening. They had been watching the sunset, sipping lemonade, the air buzzing with crickets. Out of nowhere, he turned to her and said it again, in that same half-playful, half-serious tone. "You know, Helen, you will never find anyone better than me." She had laughed then, gently shaking her head. "Don't start that again," she had replied, but her heart had softened at the familiar banter. She had not known that it would be the last time. Now those words had rooted themselves so deeply in her chest that she could not imagine a life beyond them. She felt almost guilty imagining what it would mean to prove him wrong. Wouldn't it be disloyal to even try? But at the same time, she felt a strange resentment for the prison those words created. Could love, even love as deep as theirs, still hold her captive after death? Helen moved toward the living room and sat on the sofa, the one where Richard had always stretched out his legs while reading the newspaper. She traced the worn fabric with her fingertips, the threads familiar under her touch. She imagined his voice again, the sound of it so clear that for a fleeting second she almost believed he was beside her. The ache of longing swelled in her chest, but along with it came a question she could not silence. Was this it? Was she destined to live surrounded by ghosts, bound forever to a single sentence? She tried to push the thought away, but her mind began to wander back through the years. She remembered their early days when they were young and hungry for life, when everything had seemed possible. Richard had been bold, confident, always the center of attention. She had admired his certainty, even envied it. But she had been her own woman too, full of curiosity, ideas and dreams. Over the years, though, much of that part of her had gone quiet, folded gently away as they built a family, a home, a rhythm together. It had not felt like a loss at the time, it had felt like partnership. But now, sitting alone, she wondered if perhaps that other Helen still existed somewhere beneath the grief, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked softly. She looked at it and realized hours had passed without her noticing. The day had slipped into night and the house was cloaked in shadows. She reached for the lamp, but before turning it on, she lingered in the darkness, allowing herself to feel the weight of it fully. The sentence still echoed, "You will never find someone better than me." But for the first time, Helen allowed herself to ask, what if better was never the point? What if life after Richard was not about comparing, but about rediscovering? The thought startled her, almost as if she had spoken treason. Yet it lingered, stubborn and alive, refusing to be pushed away. Helen drew in a slow breath and switched on the lamp. The light filled the room, gentle but steady, chasing back the shadows. She knew the ache would return in the morning, that the silence would still sit heavy in the kitchen, that the empty chair would remain unfilled. But tonight, for the briefest moment, she felt the faint stirrings of something else, a whisper of possibility. She closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet, "Maybe you were right, Richard. Maybe I won't find someone better, but maybe, just maybe, I'll find something different." And though the silence gave no reply, Helen felt the words settle inside her like a seed. The morning sun touched the curtains with a faint golden glow, yet Helen found no comfort in the light. She moved slowly through her home, each step carrying her deeper into a labyrinth of memories. The house was no longer just brick and wood. It had become a museum of her life with Richard. Every corner seemed to whisper his name. Every object seemed to echo the presence that was no longer there. On the kitchen counter sat the blue mug with the faded map of the Great Lakes. She could still hear his voice every time he reached for it, claiming that coffee somehow tasted better from that cup than from any other. She had tried once to put it away in the cupboard, but the emptiness it left behind on the counter had felt unbearable, so she left it there untouched, as though waiting for a hand that would never reach for it again. The living room carried its own weight of remembrance. The old record player stood against the wall, a relic from their younger years. Stacks of vinyls leaned beside it, records they had collected in their 20s and 30s. Richard loved jazz, and she remembered how he would sway lightly with the music, sometimes pulling her up from the sofa to dance in the middle of the room. She could almost feel his hand on her waist, his laugh as he twirled her clumsily, both of them stumbling over the worn rug, but not caring because the music was theirs. Now the records gathered dust, the silence louder than the melodies they once carried. Helen's gaze lingered on the armchair by the fireplace. The fabric was worn thin where Richard had sat every evening, reading or dozing off with his glasses slipping down his nose. She often found herself talking toward that chair, voicing thoughts out loud, as if he were still there to answer. Sometimes it was something simple, like a comment about the weather. Other times it was heavier, questions she knew would find no reply. The act of speaking into the silence gave her brief comfort, but afterward, the silence always seemed deeper. She walked down the hallway, the photographs staring back at her. Their wedding day, the children growing, holidays, graduations, grandchildren arriving one after another. Life preserved in frames, smiling faces that told only part of the truth. Each picture was a reminder of joy, but also of the relentless passing of time. She paused at one in particular, Richard holding their eldest granddaughter on his shoulders, her little hands gripping his hair as she squealed with laughter. Helen touched the glass, her heart aching with the memory of his strong arms, his boundless patience with the children. It was in moments like these that she felt the sharpest conflict within herself. The weight of loyalty battled with the faint, guilty stirrings of desire to live beyond the grief. Was moving forward an act of betrayal? Would seeking new laughter dishonor the love she had shared with Richard? The thought unsettled her deeply. She sat on the edge of the bed that afternoon, holding one of his old sweaters against her chest, inhaling the faint scent of cologne that lingered in the fabric. Tears welled up, not just for the loss of him, but for the confusion he had left behind. Nighttime brought no relief. Lying in bed, she would sometimes imagine his breathing beside her, the rhythm that had once lulled her to sleep. She reached across the mattress more than once, her hand brushing only the cool sheet. The loneliness of that empty space was unlike anything she had ever known. Even when she was young and Richard had been away for work trips, the emptiness had been temporary. This, she knew, had no end. Her mind often wandered to the conversations they had in their final months together. Richard had spoken little about what would come after. He had never given her instructions, never shared what he wished for her life once he was gone. Instead, there had been silence, and into that silence she poured her own doubts, her own fears. She imagined what he might say if she could ask him directly, "Do you want me to be happy again? Do you want me to keep living, truly living? Or do you want me to remain yours, only yours until the end?" The answer never came, only the echo of that sentence he had repeated so often. "You will never find someone better than me." The seasons changed outside her window, but inside the house, time seemed stuck. The same chair, the same mug, the same photograph stared back at her every day. Sometimes she wished she could pack it all away, strip the house bare, and free herself from the constant reminders. But each attempt ended in failure. She would pick up a record to store it in a box, only to hold it in her lap for an hour. Remembering the way Richard's fingers tapped the beat, she would start to fold one of his shirts, then press it to her face instead, tears dampening the fabric. She could not let go, not yet. Helen knew she was trapped in a delicate balance, caught between honoring the past and fearing the future. To move on felt like betrayal. To remain still felt like surrender. She stood in the doorway of the living room one evening, looking at the chair, the record player, the shelves lined with books Richard had read again and again. The house was filled with him, and yet he was nowhere. It was a strange kind of haunting, not by ghosts but by love itself. And as the days stretched into weeks, Helen found herself asking the same unanswerable question. Was her life now meant only to be a keeper of memories, or could there be something more waiting beyond these walls? The days had grown long, not in hours but in weight. Helen often felt them pressing against her chest, heavy and unyielding, as if the very air in her house thickened with memory. The morning routines that once gave her a rhythm now only reminded her of what was missing. She still brewed 2 cups of tea, though she drank only 1. She still paused by the chair at the table, her hand brushing the backrest as if expecting warmth. She still spoke aloud, little fragments of thought directed at the silence, waiting for an answer that never came. It was a life suspended, tethered to yesterday, afraid to step into tomorrow. One late afternoon, as Helen sat in the living room with a half-finished book on her lap, the phone rang. She started slightly at the sound. It had become rare for the phone to break the stillness. Most calls these days were from her children, dutiful check-ins that left her both grateful and faintly hollow, as though they were speaking more to reassure themselves than to reach her. But this time, the voice on the other end was not family. "Helen?" It was Elżbieta, her oldest friend, her companion since they were both young women learning to navigate adulthood in a city that often felt too large for their small ambitions. Elżbieta's voice carried warmth, a kind of brightness that Helen had once leaned on, but lately had kept at arm's length. "I was just thinking about you," Helen said, though it wasn't entirely true. Thinking about anyone outside her memories of Richard had become increasingly difficult. "You were not," Elżbieta replied with a soft laugh, knowing her too well to be fooled. "But I will forgive you, because I am calling with news. There is an event at the Cultural Club this weekend. Music, food, people you have not seen in years. I want you to come." Helen's heart sank at the suggestion. The very thought of entering a room full of strangers, of laughter and chatter and music, felt foreign, even threatening. She could already picture herself standing at the edge, unable to join in, an outsider in her own skin. "Oh, Elżbieta, I don't think so. It's been so long. I wouldn't know what to do with myself." "You would breathe," her friend answered firmly. "That is what you would do. You would eat, you would laugh a little, and you would remember that the world is not finished with you yet." The words lingered after the call ended. Helen set the phone down on the table and stared at the wall, torn between the instinct to retreat and the faintest flicker of curiosity. What would it feel like to be among people again, to hear voices that were not just echoes from the past? She tried to push the thought away, telling herself it was easier to stay home, safe, predictable. But that evening, as she made her solitary dinner and placed her fork on the silent table, she heard Richard's voice again. "You will never find someone better than me." It struck her suddenly that staying cocooned in her house was not loyalty, it was fear. The next morning she called Elżbieta back. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "I will come," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating at once. Saturday arrived quicker than she expected. Helen stood in front of her wardrobe, fingers brushing over dresses she had not worn in months. Nothing seemed right. Some felt too somber, others too bright, as if she were trying too hard to imitate a woman she no longer recognized. At last, she chose a simple navy dress with soft sleeves, one Richard had always admired on her. As she fastened the buttons, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was older, lines etched into her face, eyes heavy with loss. And yet, beneath the grief, there was still something unmistakably alive. The cultural club was already buzzing when she arrived. Cars lined the street, and the faint hum of music drifted through the open doors. For a moment, Helen froze at the entrance, her hands tightening on the strap of her bag. The noise, the movement, the sheer energy of it all was overwhelming. She almost turned back, but then Elżbieta appeared, her arms wide, her smile broad, pulling Helen into the warmth of the room before she could retreat. Inside, the atmosphere was alive with color and sound. Traditional music floated through the air, mingling with the scent of homemade dishes, pierogi and goulash, filling the hall with an aroma that made Helen's stomach stir for the first time in weeks. Laughter rose and fell in waves. Conversations overlapped. Children darted between tables with carefree energy. Helen felt out of place, a spectator watching life unfold from a distance. She moved cautiously, her steps small, as though the floor beneath her might break. Yet Elżbieta was relentless in her determination. She guided Helen from one group to another, introducing her to old acquaintances, drawing her into conversations. At first, Helen answered with polite smiles, short phrases, her heart not quite in it. But then, at one table, someone began to share a story from their childhood in Poland, an absurd little memory involving a rooster, a broken fence, and a grandmother chasing after both with her apron flying behind her. The image was so vivid, so unexpected, that Helen laughed. It startled her. The sound felt unfamiliar in her own throat, as though it belonged to someone else. But it was real, and it was hers. For the first time in months, she felt her chest loosen, the weight lift just slightly. People around the table smiled at her, encouraged by her laughter, and the conversation flowed with ease. Helen found herself leaning in, listening, even contributing with her own memory from years ago. The night continued, and though the grief never vanished, it softened enough to let in something else. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the reminder that she could still feel alive. As she walked back to her car later, the cool night air brushing her skin, Helen realized that the silence waiting at home would feel different now. She had stepped, however hesitantly, back into the rhythm of the world, and though Richard's voice still echoed in her mind, tonight it did not sound like a sentence. It sounded like a memory. The night of the cultural club lingered in Helen's mind, long after she had returned home. She had expected exhaustion, perhaps even regret for stepping outside her cocoon of silence, but instead what followed her back was the faint trace of something she had nearly forgotten, the sensation of being part of life, not merely observing it from the sidelines. When she entered her quiet house, the air still felt heavy, but it was no longer unbearable. It was as if a small crack had opened in the walls she had built around her grief, letting in just enough air for her lungs to expand without pain. She replayed the evening again and again in her thoughts, each detail clinging to her memory. The tables filled with steaming plates of pierogi and stews, the bright notes of accordion music dancing through the hall, the faces of people she hadn't seen in years. At first, she had been stiff, her smile forced, her replies mechanical. She had thought about leaving within minutes, certain she was not ready. But then, like an unexpected gift, came that moment. Someone had begun telling a childhood story about chasing a rooster through a neighbor's garden, tripping over buckets, and ending with the grandmother throwing a slipper to end the chaos. The absurdity of it painted such a vivid picture in her mind that before she could stop herself, Helen had laughed. An unguarded, genuine laugh that spilled out of her like water breaking through a dam. It had been months since such a sound left her lips. The memory of it startled her more than anything else. She had cried so often that her tears had become a second language, but laughter had vanished from her world, exiled with Richard's passing. That night at the club, in the middle of strangers and friends, laughter had crept back in, timid but alive. And for a brief moment, Helen did not feel like a widow or a woman bound by the shadow of her past. She simply felt human, whole, present. Still, when she awoke the next morning, a heaviness settled over her again. She sat at the kitchen table, her tea cooling as she stared at the empty chair across from her. She half expected the joy of the previous night to dissolve like a dream, leaving her emptier than before. But as she replayed the memory of her own laughter, something unusual happened. The corners of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but not far from it either. Even in the midst of silence, she could still hear the echo of that sound. It was fragile, yes, but it was also proof that the part of her capable of joy was not gone, only buried beneath sorrow. Later that day, she wandered into the living room and approached the old record player. Dust had settled over it, its presence a silent accusation of abandonment. For weeks she had avoided it, afraid that music would only cut deeper into her wounds. But now, with trembling fingers, she lifted one of the records from the stack. It was one Richard had loved, a soft jazz album they had played countless times. She hesitated, almost putting it back, but then she set it gently on the turntable and lowered the needle. The familiar crackle filled the room, followed by the warm notes of a saxophone. Helen closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. She expected tears, but what came instead was a surprising calm. She remembered the nights when Richard would pull her into the middle of the room, urging her to dance despite her protests. She remembered how clumsy they had been, laughing as they tripped over each other's feet, yet never once caring about grace. The memory of their laughter together fused with the memory of her own from the previous night, and for the first time, it did not hurt as much as it healed. She began to move, barely at first, just a sway of her shoulders, a tap of her foot. It felt awkward, as though she were inhabiting someone else's body. But then, slowly, her movements grew more natural, her hands brushing against her dress as she let the music guide her. She opened her eyes and caught her reflection in the window, an older woman swaying alone in her living room. A woman who had lost, who had mourned, but who still had the capacity to move with music. The image made her chuckle, a small laugh escaping her lips. 2 laughs now, in less than 2 days. It struck her then how strange grief was, how it could coexist with tiny sparks of joy. For so long, Helen had believed that to feel happiness again would mean betraying Richard's memory, as though laughter could erase the love they had shared. But standing there, the music filling the room, she realized the opposite was true. Every smile, every laugh, every step she took forward did not erase him. It carried him. Because her laughter was born from the very life they had built together, from the stories and the love that had shaped her into who she was. That evening, she wrote in her journal something she had not done since Richard's illness. Her words were shaky at first, but they grew steadier as she let her thoughts pour out. "I laughed today," she wrote, "not just once but twice. It felt like sunlight after a long winter. I thought I had forgotten how, but perhaps laughter remembers us even when we forget it." The next few days carried her back into the rhythm of ordinary life, but now she moved with a faint, invisible thread of possibility tied around her. She found herself humming while folding laundry, pausing to watch the birds longer than usual, even lingering in front of the mirror a moment more before leaving the room. The grief remained heavy and real, but she began to suspect it did not have to be the only thing left. And deep down, Helen knew that the first laugh was not just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something, not a replacement for what she had lost. Never that. But perhaps, just perhaps, a reminder that life was not finished with her yet. She could still be surprised, she could still feel warmth, she could still laugh, and that meant maybe she could still live. The following week, Helen found herself still replaying the laughter from that evening at the cultural club, as if it were a fragile flame she had managed to shield against the winds of grief. She moved through her days cautiously, unwilling to let that spark die out, but equally afraid of nurturing it too much. Grief had made her suspicious of joy, as if happiness carried a price she would later have to pay. And yet, when Elzbieta called again, inviting her to another gathering at the club, Helen surprised herself by saying yes, before doubt had the chance to silence her. When she arrived, the hall was once again alive with voices, music, and the aromas of familiar foods. But this time the air felt different, or perhaps it was she who had changed. She did not cling as tightly to the edges of the room. She moved among conversations, not as a ghost, but as a woman cautiously stepping back into life. And then, in the midst of laughter, and the shuffle of people finding seats, her eyes caught his. Tomasz. He was seated near the corner of the room, his posture relaxed, his expression carrying a kind of quiet dignity. He looked to be around her age, perhaps a few years older, his silver hair neatly combed, his presence unassuming yet grounding, as though he had learned the art of being fully present without demanding attention. His eyes, when they met hers, were gentle, steady, and she felt something inside her chest shift. Not a thunderclap, not a lightning bolt, but a subtle warmth, a reminder that connection could be born not from noise, but from silence shared between two souls. She looked away quickly, almost embarrassed by the sudden jolt of awareness. She told herself not to be foolish, that she was only imagining things, that her mind was playing tricks on her in this season of vulnerability. But when Elżbieta led her toward the refreshment table, she noticed Tomasz had risen from his chair and was slowly making his way in the same direction. Their meeting was simple, almost ordinary. He stood near her as she reached for a plate, and after a moment he spoke, his voice carrying a calmness that felt like balm. "Would you mind if I sat near you?" Helen blinked, surprised by the directness, yet relieved by its gentleness. She nodded, her words catching slightly. "No, I would not mind." They found seats together at a table near the back, the music a soft hum in the background. What struck Helen first was that Tomasz did not fill the silence with empty chatter. He waited. He allowed space for her to speak, and when she did, his eyes did not wander. His attention did not drift. It had been so long since anyone had listened to her with that kind of focus that she almost felt undone by it. Their conversation unfolded slowly, like a familiar melody rediscovered after years of silence. They spoke of music, of the old records both still owned, of recipes passed down from mothers and grandmothers. He told her about his love for gardening, how he found peace in watching tomatoes ripen under the summer sun. She shared how Richard had once insisted on planting roses, despite knowing little about them, and how the garden had eventually turned into a wild, beautiful mess. As she spoke, she realized something astonishing. She was not talking about Richard with tears. Instead, she was smiling, the memories colored not only by grief, but by gratitude. Tomasz did not flinch at the mention of her late husband. He did not try to change the subject or offer platitudes. He simply listened, nodding, acknowledging, holding space for both the sorrow and the joy woven into her words. The hours slipped by unnoticed. What felt like a brief exchange turned into an evening, and when the time came to leave, Helen was startled by how easily the night had passed. She walked to her car with a strange sensation in her chest, not heavy, not sharp, but light, as if a door she had thought locked forever had creaked open just enough for air to slip through. That night, alone in her house, she sat in her armchair and let the memories of Tomasz's gaze settle over her. His eyes had not been filled with pity, nor with judgment, but with something she struggled to name. It was not passion, not yet, nor was it simple friendliness. It was a recognition, a quiet understanding that perhaps only another soul who had walked through loss could offer. Helen pressed her palms together, uncertain whether to pray, to weep, or to laugh. The words of Richard returned to her again, uninvited as always. "You will never find someone better than me." But tonight they carried less sting. She whispered into the silence, "Maybe not better, Richard, but maybe someone who sees me as I am now." Sleep came to her more gently that night, not as an escape, but as a continuation of the soft stirring that had begun in her heart. She did not know what the days ahead would bring, nor whether Tomasz's gaze had been as meaningful to him as it had been to her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt that her story was not entirely finished. Something was waiting, and she was just beginning to turn toward it. Helen woke the next morning with a strange lightness she hadn't felt in a long time, but it was quickly followed by unease. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her cup of tea, staring at the chair across from her. Richard's chair, the same one she had stared at every morning since his passing, yet something was different now. The memory of Tomasz's calm eyes, the way he listened without rushing her words, had slipped into her morning silence like a guest she hadn't invited, but couldn't send away. She told herself it was nothing, just a conversation, just an evening made easier by companionship. She reminded herself that people talk, people laugh, and then go home. But deep inside, She knew what unsettled her. She had felt something. It wasn't grand or overwhelming, but it was there, subtle and insistent. The spark of being seen again. That feeling frightened her. It felt almost like betrayal. She had lived with Richard for 40 years, shared every season of her adult life with him. He had been her partner, her anchor, her confidant. How could she even allow the possibility of warmth from another man without dishonoring his memory? The words he used to repeat haunted her again. "You will never find someone better than me." She had laughed at them when he was alive, but now they echoed like a verdict. Had she already betrayed him just by letting herself enjoy Tomasz's company? She rose from the table and walked through the house, each room reminding her of Richard. The worn armchair by the fireplace, the record player still resting silently against the wall, the photographs that chronicled their years together. She touched the glass of one frame, their wedding photo, and whispered, "I haven't forgotten Richard. I never will." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe that moving forward, even in the smallest way, didn't mean erasing him, but the guilt clung to her like a second skin. That evening she sat in her armchair, trying to read, but her mind wandered endlessly back to Tomasz. She remembered the softness of his voice, the way he didn't interrupt her stories, the patience in his gaze. She remembered how she had smiled, not because she forced herself to, but because she wanted to. It was such a small thing, a smile, but in her world of silence it felt enormous, and yet every time the memory brought a flicker of warmth, guilt rushed in to smother it. She imagined what people would say if they knew she had spent hours talking to another man. It is too soon. She should live in memory, not move on. The imagined voices of judgment pierced her heart. But what hurt more was her own voice, the one inside her that whispered she was betraying Richard simply by feeling alive again. Helen rose and walked to the window, staring out into the quiet night. The garden looked wild, untended since Richard's passing. He had once loved planting roses, even though they rarely grew as planned. She remembered teasing him about it, and the way he insisted that even imperfect roses still deserved a chance to bloom. The memory made her chest ache. Perhaps she too was like that garden, messy, untended, yet still capable of life. She pressed her hand against the glass and whispered, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." The silence gave no answer, but in that moment, she realized the truth of her fear. It wasn't only about betraying Richard, it was also about betraying herself. If she let herself feel again and then lost it, could she survive another grief? The next days unfolded with this tension pulling at her heart. She went about her routines, the tea, the dishes, the laundry, but every small action seemed weighed down by questions she couldn't escape. She caught herself wondering if Tomasz was thinking of her, if he remembered their conversation, if he had felt the same unspoken connection she had. Then she would scold herself, forcing her mind back into silence, afraid to let her imagination run too far. And yet, despite her resistance, something had shifted. The world outside her grief no longer felt entirely closed. There was a faint crack in the wall she had built around herself, and through it, light seeped in. It terrified her, but it also reminded her she was still alive. That contradiction, hope tangled with fear, became her constant companion. One night she dreamed of Richard. In the dream, he was sitting in his old armchair, reading the newspaper, looking exactly as he had in life. She walked into the room and sat across from him, waiting for him to speak. At last he lowered the paper, looked at her with that familiar, crooked smile and said, "So, you laughed again, did you?" She tried to explain, to apologize, but before she could, he chuckled and said, "Good, don't stop." She woke with tears streaming down her face, unsure if it had been just a dream or something more. Helen sat upright in bed, her hands trembling. The guilt was still there, but so was the memory of his voice, softened by approval instead of judgment. She knew it didn't erase her fear, but it planted a seed of permission, a seed she wasn't sure she was ready to water, but one she could not ignore. For the first time since Richard's passing, Helen did not dread the morning. She rose, made her tea, and sat at the table, staring at the chair across from her. The absence still hurt, but beneath the pain she felt something else, a question she dared not yet answer. What if hope was not a betrayal, but a continuation of love? That question lingered with her all day, a soft echo that refused to fade. And though she was still afraid, Though she still clung to the memory of Richard with all her heart, she began to suspect that fear itself might be the bridge she had to cross in order to live again. The phone rang on a Tuesday morning, pulling Helen from her half-hearted attempt at reorganizing the linen closet. She had been folding and refolding the same pile of towels, not because they needed order, but because the act of arranging gave her a momentary sense of control. When the shrill sound broke through the silence, she hesitated. Most calls came from her children, and she often let them go to voicemail, afraid of the pity she would hear in their voices. But something nudged her this time. She reached for the receiver. "Helen?" The voice on the other end was unmistakable. Steady, low, touched with that calmness she remembered. It was Tomasz. For a moment she couldn't speak. Her heart began to beat too fast, her palms damp against the cool plastic of the phone. "Yes, this is Helen. It's Tomasz. We met at the club the other evening." "I remember," she said, her voice soft, almost shy. There was a pause, then his words came carefully as though he was trying not to intrude. "I was wondering if you might like to join me for coffee one morning. Nothing formal, just conversation. Perhaps at the little bakery on 3rd Street. Do you know it?" Helen closed her eyes, picturing the place. She had walked past it countless times, the smell of fresh bread drifting onto the sidewalk. She had never gone in. The idea of sitting there across from him felt both inviting and terrifying. She almost said no, the word hovering on her lips out of habit. But then she remembered her dream of Richard's voice, telling her not to stop laughing. And before she could retreat, she whispered, "Yes, I know it. When were you thinking?" "Tomorrow morning, if that suits you." It was settled. After hanging up, Helen stood in the quiet of her house, her pulse still racing. The weight of the decision pressed on her. What if people saw her? What if someone whispered that she had moved on too quickly? What if she was unprepared for the emotions it might stir? She nearly called him back to cancel, but something stronger kept her from doing so. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps hope, perhaps the fragile desire to feel alive again. The next morning, Helen took care in choosing her clothes. Not too much, she told herself, not as if this were a date. She settled on a soft grey sweater and a navy skirt, simple but neat. She studied her reflection in the mirror, the lines around her eyes more pronounced than she remembered, her hair thinner than it once was. She almost turned away, but then she noticed something else in her reflection, a trace of anticipation she had not seen in years. At the bakery, Tomasz was already seated at a small table by the window. He rose when he saw her, his smile warm but unassuming. "You came," he said, as though he had not quite dared to believe it. "I did," Helen answered, her voice barely above a whisper. They ordered coffee, and as the minutes unfolded, Helen felt the strangest sense of ease. Tomasz did not rush her words, nor fill the pauses with needless chatter. He asked questions about her life, but not the kind that skimmed the surface. He wanted to know about the small things, her favorite books, the recipes she cherished, the walks she used to take with Richard by the lake. When she spoke, he listened, truly listened, with an attentiveness that felt both rare and disarming. At one point, Helen mentioned how she still kept Richard's mug on the kitchen counter, unable to put it away. She braced herself for discomfort, for pity, for awkward silence, but Tomasz simply nodded. "I still keep Anna's scarf on the back of the chair by my bed," he said quietly. "She passed 3 years ago. Some mornings, I hold it before I even rise. I don't think grief ever leaves us. It just changes its weight." The honesty of his words struck her. For the first time, she realized he carried his own scars, his own empty spaces. She was not alone in this strange in-between world of loss and lingering love. That recognition created a bond she could not ignore. They talked for nearly 2 hours, the time slipping by unnoticed. Helen found herself laughing again, softly but genuinely, at one of his stories about burning an entire batch of pierogi because he had been distracted by an old radio show. The sound of her own laughter startled her, but Tomasz smiled, his eyes crinkling in a way that made her feel lighter. When it came time to part, Helen felt an unexpected pang of reluctance. She did not want the conversation to end. Tomasz walked her to her car, and as they stood by the door, he said simply, "I would like to see you again if you would allow it." Her heart thudded in her chest. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. Driving home, Helen felt something stirring inside her that she had buried under months of sorrow. Hope, fragile, uncertain, but alive. She knew fear would return, that guilt would whisper its accusations in the quiet of her kitchen. But she also knew something else now. She was capable of connection, capable of being heard, capable of feeling warmth without erasing the love she had lost. That night, Helen did not sit in her armchair speaking into silence. She did not cry into Richard's sweater. Instead, she opened her journal and wrote, "I met Tomasz for coffee today. He listened, really listened, and for the first time, I felt as though someone had seen not just my grief, but me. I do not know where this will lead, but perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps the point is that I am still here, still breathing, still able to feel." As she closed the book, Helen realized something she had not admitted even to herself. She wanted to see Tomasz again, and that wanting, simple as it was, felt like a small rebellion against the silence that had imprisoned her for so long. The days after Helen's meeting with Tomasz seemed to move with a rhythm she had not felt in a long time. For months her life had been measured in silences, in the steady ticking of clocks, in the shadows that stretched across empty rooms. But now there was something different, an echo of his voice in her memory, the way he had said her name with gentleness, the way he had spoken of his late wife without shame, without hiding. It was as though their conversation had carved out a small space inside her grief, a space where something new could live. Yet alongside this fragile hope came another presence, heavier and darker: guilt. It returned with force when she found herself standing before the old chest in her bedroom, the one where she had carefully packed away so many fragments of Richard's life. She had not opened it in months, not since the day she folded his sweaters with trembling hands and tucked them away, unable to face them every morning. But something drove her there now. Perhaps it was the need to remind herself of the love she had shared, to hold on to it fiercely before it slipped further from her grasp. She lifted the lid slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The scent rose to meet her immediately, faint traces of cologne, soap, and something uniquely him. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she thought she might close it again, but then her hands found the stack of photographs at the top, and she could not resist. One by one she laid them across the bed. Richard smiling on their wedding day, his arm protectively around her waist. Richard holding their firstborn child, his face radiant with awe. Richard standing at the grill in the backyard, wearing his old straw hat, his grin wide and carefree. The memories came alive with each image, each one striking her heart with both sweetness and ache. She whispered to the empty room, "I remember. I still remember everything." Tears blurred her vision as she held one photo longer than the others. Richard on a family trip, kneeling in the sand to help their grandson build a castle. His face in that moment had been so open, so full of joy, that Helen felt her breath catch. The thought struck her with sharp clarity. She did not want to forget him, she could not. Even as she had laughed with Tomasz, even as she had felt her heart stir, she realized the foundation of her love for Richard remained unshaken. It lived within her, still unerasable. And yet that realization did not ease her guilt. If anything, it sharpened it. Could she truly allow herself to move forward while holding on to this past? Would opening her heart to someone new be an act of betrayal, a rewriting of a love that had defined her for 4 decades? Her mind swirled with questions, none of them offering peace. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, the photographs spread before her, the chair opposite still empty. She reached across the table as though Richard were there, her hand brushing the cool wood. "I don't want to replace you," she whispered. "I couldn't, even if I tried. But I don't know how to live with this emptiness either." The silence that answered was the same silence she had grown to know intimately, a silence that offered no direction, no absolution. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what Richard would say. Would he scold her? Would he laugh and tell her she was overthinking? Or would he, as in her dream, simply tell her to go on living? The next day, as she folded laundry, her mind kept circling back to Tomasz. The way he had spoken about his late wife had touched her deeply. He had not hidden his grief, nor tried to erase it. He carried it openly, but not as a burden, more as a companion he had learned to walk beside. That image lingered in her mind. Perhaps grief did not demand erasure or replacement. Perhaps it could coexist with something new, just as love for one child did not erase love for another. Still, the doubts gnawed at her. What would others say? Already she could hear the whispers of neighbors, the judgments unspoken but sharp. It is too soon. She is forgetting him. She should stay faithful to his memory. The imagined voices grew louder each time she allowed herself to feel even a flicker of warmth for Tomasz. That night, unable to sleep, Helen returned to her journal. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "I am afraid of forgetting Richard, afraid of betraying him. But I am also afraid of staying here, locked in this silence, until I forget myself." The words startled her. Forgetting herself, that was the deeper fear, the one she had not named before. She realized then that Richard had never asked her to stop being Helen. Even in his teasing, in that phrase he loved to repeat, "You will never find someone better than me," there had been affection, not a command. Maybe the true test of honoring his memory was not to vanish into it, but to carry it forward while still living. She closed the journal and sat in the darkness, the weight of grief still present but softened by the flicker of understanding. She did not know what the future with Tomasz might hold. Perhaps nothing more than companionship, perhaps something deeper, but she knew now that remembering Richard and opening her heart again were not enemies. They could exist side by side, not as rivals, but as chapters of the same life. And with that thought, for the first time since his passing, Helen allowed herself to breathe deeply, not in surrender to grief, but in quiet acceptance that love, in all its forms, was never meant to end. It was meant to expand. The days after Helen reopened the chest of memories were heavy, yet strangely calmer than before. She had wept, she had clutched the photographs, she had whispered into the silence, and still, she had risen the next morning. Something had shifted. Perhaps it was not peace, not yet, but a softer rhythm had entered her life. She was still grieving, but the grief no longer stood as a wall. It became more like a river she had learned to wade through, sometimes slowly, sometimes with trembling legs, but always moving forward. It was during one of these mornings that Tomasz called again. She recognized his voice instantly, that steady warmth that carried neither demand nor pressure. "Would you like to join me for a walk?" he asked. "The weather is kind today, and I find the park quieter in the mornings." Helen hesitated, the old instinct to retreat rising up. To accept would mean leaving the safety of her routines, exposing herself again to moments that might bring both comfort and confusion. But she thought of her journal, of the words she had written. "Afraid of forgetting myself." Slowly she said, "Yes, I think I would like that." The next morning she dressed carefully, choosing a long coat and a scarf Richard had once bought her at a winter market. She felt almost as if she were carrying both of them with her past and her present, as she stepped out into the crisp air. The park greeted her with quiet pathways lined with bare trees, their branches stretching like thin fingers into the pale sky. Tomasz was waiting near the entrance, his hands in his pockets, his smile small but sincere. They began to walk side by side. At first, their conversation was light, circling around the weather, the beauty of the changing seasons, the children who ran ahead of their parents on the playground. But soon, their steps found a rhythm, and so did their words. He told her of his youth, of coming to the country with little more than determination and a suitcase of books. She shared stories of her early teaching days, the joy she once found in the laughter of children in her classroom. There was no rush, no urgency. Just two people, learning the contours of each other's company. Helen found herself enjoying the simplicity of it, the way silence between them was not uncomfortable, the way a shared glance could say enough. She had thought walking beside another man would feel unnatural, even wrong. Yet here she was, her heart not burdened by betrayal, but buoyed by something gentler, companionship. When they reached a bench overlooking the pond, they sat for a while. Ducks drifted lazily across the water, and Helen found herself remembering how Richard had once loved feeding them with their grandchildren. She smiled at the memory, and for the first time, she spoke of it aloud to Tomasz. She expected pain, perhaps tears, but instead what rose in her was gratitude. "Richard used to bring the children here," she said softly. "He would buy them little bags of breadcrumbs, and they would laugh so hard when the ducks fought over them. I used to think those moments were ordinary, but now I see they were everything." Tomasz listened, nodding slowly. "Anna and I used to sit near the water in the evenings," he said. She would bring her knitting, and I would read. Sometimes we hardly spoke, but it was enough just to be together. Their words wove together, threads of memory from two different lives, two different losses, yet instead of pulling them backward, the memories seemed to build a bridge between them. Helen realized then that sharing did not lessen her love for Richard, nor diminish Tomasz's for Anna. Instead, it honored them both, keeping their presence alive while allowing space for something new. As days turned into weeks, their meetings became small rituals. Sometimes they walked in the park, sometimes they sat at the bakery sipping coffee, sometimes they simply strolled through the local market, pointing out favorite fruits and vegetables as if rediscovering the simple pleasures of life. Helen found herself laughing more often, not always loudly, but enough to feel the change in her chest. She caught herself humming as she folded laundry, humming as she cooked, humming as she opened the curtains in the morning. The silence of her house no longer suffocated. It began to coexist with the sound of possibility. Still, fear lingered. She often asked herself, late at night, if she was moving too quickly, if she was stepping into dangerous territory where grief and hope collided. She pictured the faces of friends and neighbors, imagined their whispers. She has found someone already. She has forgotten her husband. But when these fears pressed too heavily, she remembered the look in Tomasz's eyes, the way he never tried to replace, never tried to erase. He simply stood beside her, as though saying, "We carry them with us, always." One afternoon, as they walked together beneath a soft drizzle, Tomasz paused. "I do not want to rush you," he said gently. "I only want to be someone you feel safe with. Nothing more, nothing less." The simplicity of his words disarmed her. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from relief. She realized then that she had been waiting for permission, not just from Richard's memory, not just from society, but from herself. Permission to live, to feel, to step forward without fear of erasing the past. That night, Helen wrote in her journal once more, "I walked today, not just in the park, but into something new. I am still afraid, but the fear no longer keeps me still. Perhaps life is not about choosing between holding on and moving on. Perhaps it is about learning to carry both, love that was and love that might be." As she closed the book, she glanced at Richard's photograph on the nightstand. She touched the frame lightly, her voice a whisper. "I will always love you, but I think you would want me to keep walking." And for the first time in a long time, Helen lay down to sleep, not with the weight of grief pressing her chest, but with the quiet, steady beat of hope. For weeks, Helen had walked a path she never imagined she would tread. The companionship of Tomasz had become something she not only accepted, but quietly cherished. Their walks in the park, their slow conversations over steaming cups of coffee, their laughter at small absurdities, all of it had grown into a rhythm she looked forward to. It was a fragile joy, one she held carefully, like a bird in her hands, afraid that any sudden movement would make it fly away. Yet beneath this new rhythm, another sound began to grow louder, sharp and unwelcome, the voices of others. It started subtly, in the glances. A neighbor who had once stopped to chat now waved from a distance instead. An acquaintance from church tilted her head in that way people do when their words are not questions, but quiet judgments. Even among family, Helen sensed the unspoken tension. Her daughter had asked, "How are you spending your days, Mom?" in a tone layered with more than simple curiosity. And when Helen mentioned going for walks, there was a pause on the other end of the phone, heavy enough to feel. The comments came eventually, whispered through the grapevine, carried to her by those who thought they were offering concern. "Isn't it too soon?" someone had said. "She's only been without Richard for months." Another voice added, "I suppose everyone grieves differently, but I could never." The words reached Helen like small cuts, invisible but stinging. One afternoon, she overheard two women from the community center speaking just as she walked in. They lowered their voices too late. "She's already keeping company with a man," one said. "After all those years with Richard, I would have thought she'd remain faithful." The word struck Helen's chest like a stone. Faithful. As if love was measured not by the decades she had lived with Richard, not by the years she had cared for him through illness, but by her willingness to remain frozen forever in widowhood. That evening, she sat alone at the kitchen table, the mug of tea cooling untouched in her hands. Guilt returned with a weight that bent her shoulders. She thought of Richard's voice again. "You will never find someone better than me." The phrase twisted differently now, mixed with the voices of neighbors, the whispers of judgment. Was she proving them all right by allowing Tomasz into her life? Was she diminishing what she and Richard had shared? When Tomasz called that night, she almost didn't answer. But something in her could not bear to let the silence win, so she picked up. His voice was calm as always, steady and unhurried. He asked how her day had been, and Helen found herself faltering, unable to keep her fears hidden. "Tomasz," she said finally, her voice trembling, "people are beginning to talk. They think it's too soon. They think I'm betraying Richard." There was a long pause. She imagined him choosing his words carefully, not out of hesitation but out of respect. At last he said, "Helen, grief belongs to no one but the one who carries it. Others will always have opinions, but they do not walk in your shoes. They did not wake in the night to Richard's absence. They do not sit in silence at your table. Only you know the weight of your days, and only you can decide how to live them." His words sank into her, but the guilt still clung stubbornly. "But what if they are right?" she whispered. "What if love means never letting go?" Tomasz's reply was soft but firm. "Love does not vanish when we open our hearts again. It does not divide itself like a loaf of bread, giving less to one because more is offered to another. It multiplies. My love for Anna still lives in me. It will never leave. And yet, I have room for something more. Not to replace her, never that, but to honor her by continuing to live fully. I think Richard would want the same for you." Helen closed her eyes, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. His words carried no demand, no persuasion, only truth spoken from experience. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine love not as a chain tying her to the past, nor as a betrayal, but as something that could expand, layering itself like the seasons of a tree. The roots remained, strong and unshakable, but new branches could still grow toward the sun. Still, the fear of judgment lingered. She saw it in the sidelong glances at the market, heard it in the measured tones of acquaintances. But something had changed inside her after Tomasz's words. The whispers no longer cut as deeply. They stung, yes, but she began to see them for what they were, voices of people who had not lived her life, who had not borne her grief, who had not sat in her silence. Their opinions were theirs to carry. Her life was hers. A week later, she met Tomasz again at the bakery. As they sat across from each other, sipping coffee, she looked at him with a steadier gaze. "People will talk," she said simply. "But I am tired of living as if their voices matter more than my own heart." Tomasz smiled, his eyes kind and unwavering. "Then let them talk. We will live." Helen returned home that evening lighter than she had felt in months. The voices of others had not vanished, but they no longer ruled her. She knew they would still linger, perhaps even grow louder as time went on. But she also knew something stronger now. The truth that love was not a limited resource, not a fragile vase that shattered when touched again. Love was a river, flowing endlessly, carving new paths while still carrying the memory of every bend it had passed. As she sat by the window that night, watching the stars emerge one by one, Helen whispered into the quiet, not to silence, but to Richard himself. "You were my first great love. That will never change. But maybe life is asking me to keep loving in another way too. Not less, not instead, just more." For the first time, she felt not only the weight of grief, but the quiet strength of acceptance. And with it came the courage to take another step forward, not away from Richard, but alongside the memory of him, into the possibility of something new. The autumn days had grown shorter, and with each early sunset, Helen found herself reflecting more deeply on the strange path her life had taken since Richard's passing. It was a path marked first by unbearable silence, then by hesitant steps into light, and now by the quiet, steady presence of Tomasz. The world outside seemed to mirror her own transformation, leaves changing color, the air cooling, the landscape preparing for something new while still honoring what had been. One evening, she sat with a group of old friends in Elżbieta's living room. The gathering was small, just a handful of women who had known each other for decades, women who had seen one another through weddings, births, illnesses, and goodbyes. They drank tea from mismatched cups, nibbled on pastries and let the conversation flow from one memory to another. At first it was light and familiar, stories of children, laughter over forgotten recipes, the occasional sigh about the way time moved too quickly. But as the evening deepened, the talk turned, as it often did among women of their age, to the subject of absence. One spoke of her brother who had passed, another of her husband's long illness, the air filled with the kind of honesty that only comes when the heart has been weathered by years of love and loss. Helen listened, nodding, her hands wrapped around her cup, her heart heavy with recognition. Then, without quite meaning to, she found herself speaking. "Richard used to say something to me," she began softly, her voice trembling at the memory. "He said it often, always with a little smile, but with such certainty. He would say, 'You will never find someone better than me.'" The women chuckled, as she knew they would. They could picture it, could imagine the teasing pride behind the words. But Helen did not laugh. She looked down at her cup, her eyes brimming with tears that refused to stay hidden. For a long time after he died, those words felt like a sentence. They echoed in my mind as if he had locked me in them forever. I believed him. I believed that I could never look beyond what we had, that if I even tried, it would mean I loved him less. The room grew quiet. Hilsbieta reached across and touched her hand gently, but Helen kept speaking, the words spilling out with a force she had not expected. "But I have come to see it differently now. He was right in a way. I haven't found anyone better. How could I? Richard was my first great love, my companion for 40 years, the man who shaped so much of who I am. There is no comparison. There will never be. But I have found someone different. Someone who listens to me in the present, who understands what it is to lose and yet still to live. And in that difference, I have found not betrayal, but a kind of rediscovery of him, of myself, of life." Her voice broke on the last words, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of what she had confessed. But then something surprising happened. Instead of judgment, instead of whispers or pity, the women around her nodded. Their eyes softened. Some glistened with tears, and one of them whispered, "That is love too, Helen. Not less. Just love in another form." Helen's chest loosened. The burden of Richard's sentence, which had once felt like chains around her heart, transformed in that moment. It was no longer a curse, no longer a verdict. It became a truth reimagined. She had not found anyone better, but she had not needed to. What she had found was another chapter, another way of being, another chance to breathe. That night, walking home under the autumn stars, she whispered aloud into the cool air as though Richard might still be listening. "You were right, my love. I didn't find better. I found different. And in finding different, I found myself again." Her steps were slow but steady, her heart no longer divided between guilt and longing. For the first time, she felt both loves living inside her without conflict, woven together not as rivals, but as threads of the same tapestry. Richard's presence remained, not diminished but transformed, while Tomasz's companionship offered her the chance to live fully in the time she still had. When she reached her door, Helen paused before entering, her hand resting on the handle. The house inside was still the same, the photographs on the wall, the chair by the fireplace, the record player waiting silently. But she was not the same. She no longer entered carrying only grief. She carried gratitude, memory, and the fragile but undeniable promise of a life still unfolding. That evening, before going to bed, she opened her journal and wrote, "Love does not end. It reshapes, it stretches, it learns to make room. Richard lives in my laughter, in my memories, in the roots of my being. Tomasz lives in my present, in the possibility of new joy. I am not betraying either. I am simply living, and perhaps that is the greatest act of love of all." She closed the book with hands that no longer trembled. For the first time since Richard's death, Helen felt whole, not because the pain was gone, but because she had learned to carry it alongside hope. The sentence that once haunted her was no longer a prison. It had become a bridge, leading her from who she had been to who she was becoming. Helen's 67th birthday dawned with the soft glow of morning sun spilling gently across her bedroom curtains. She had expected the day to feel heavy, another marker of time passing without Richard at her side. Yet when she opened her eyes, she felt a calmness she had not known in years. The grief was still there, it always would be, but it no longer defined the day before it began. Instead, there was anticipation, a quiet hum of joy that surprised her with its steadiness. Her children had insisted on organizing a small gathering at her house, and though at first she had resisted, she now found herself grateful. The thought of her family, her grandchildren, her friends filling the rooms with laughter and chatter made her heart ache with tenderness. For so long, this house had echoed with silence. Today, it would echo with life. By late afternoon, the home that had once seemed unbearably empty was alive again. The dining table was laden with dishes brought by her children and friends, platters of roasted meats, salads, bowls of fruit, cakes dusted with powdered sugar. The scent of cinnamon and coffee filled the air. The walls, once muted, seemed to lean in toward the laughter of children running through the hallways, their footsteps a rhythm that brought the old wooden floors back to life. Helen moved through the room slowly, her eyes lingering on the faces of those she loved most. Her daughter Sarah stood by the counter pouring drinks, her brow furrowed in concentration, so like Richard's when he used to prepare coffee for guests. Her son David laughed with his children on the rug, his gestures echoing the playful energy his father once had. Watching them filled Helen with a bittersweet joy, for she saw Richard everywhere, not in absence but in the continuation of his presence through them. As she carried a tray of glasses into the living room, her eyes met Tomasz's across the room. He was speaking quietly with Elżbieta, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. When he noticed Helen, his gaze softened, and in that moment, she felt something powerful yet gentle, the assurance that she was not walking alone. He did not need to stand beside her constantly to make her feel supported. His very presence was enough to remind her she had stepped into a new season, one not defined by loss, but by balance, between honoring the past and embracing the present. Later, when the cake was brought out, an apple cake baked by her granddaughter with far too much sugar and uneven layers, the room erupted in laughter. Candles flickered as the family gathered around, their voices rising in song. Helen closed her eyes as she made her wish, and for the first time it was not a wish for what she had lost, but gratitude for what she still had. As the evening wore on, and the house grew warm with conversation, Helen slipped quietly onto the porch for a moment of solitude. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. She breathed deeply, the cool air filling her lungs, and allowed herself to feel the fullness of the moment. Behind her, laughter spilled through the open door. Inside her, memories of Richard blended seamlessly with the warmth of the life unfolding around her. Tomasz stepped out after a while, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her without a word, then stood beside her watching the last of the daylight fade. For a long moment they were silent, but it was not the suffocating silence of grief she had once known. It was the gentle, companionable silence of 2 souls standing in recognition of all they had carried and all they still hoped to live. Finally, Helen spoke, her voice steady but soft. "Do you know, Tomasz, I used to believe my life had ended when Richard died, that everything meaningful had already passed, and that the rest would be only shadows of what once was. But I see now that life doesn't end with loss. It shifts, it reshapes, it carries grief, yes, but also joy. Sometimes I think it even begins again in ways we could never imagine." Tomasz nodded, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "It does not begin again because we forget. It begins again because we remember and still choose to live." Helen smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. She realized then that she had reached a place she once thought impossible. The sentence Richard had left her with, "You will never find someone better than me," no longer haunted her as a chain. It lived within her as a truth, one that did not diminish what she had found now. Richard had been her first love, her great love. Tomasz was her present companion, her reminder that life stretched beyond endings, and she herself was more than both. She was a woman who had endured, who had wept, who had laughed again, who had chosen not to let grief be her only inheritance. When the evening came to a close and the house fell quiet once more, Helen did not feel the same hollow emptiness that had once greeted her in silence. Instead, she felt the echo of voices lingering like music that refuses to fade. She touched the frame of Richard's photograph on the mantel as she passed and whispered, "Thank you." for the years, for the love, for everything. You will always be with me." Then she turned out the lights, her steps steady, her heart full. For the first time in what felt like forever, Helen understood a simple truth. Life is not about replacing, nor about forgetting. It is about carrying every love, every memory, every joy and sorrow together, until they weave into a light strong enough to guide us forward. Her home was no longer a museum of absence. It was alive again, with laughter, with hope, with gratitude. And as she closed her eyes that night, Helen felt not the weight of endings, but the quiet promise of beginnings.